I'll begin with a few big questions that we ask in law, politics, and culture, and give some examples of the approaches we take to answering these questions. First question, why did NATO chief Mark Rutte call Trump daddy? Of course, we read the US Constitution, which shows that all power should lie with the people, and that the president only executes that power in a manner that is checked by the separation of powers. But how then is it possible that anti-democratic leaders can rise to power and rule over the people as if they were his children? These are not just legal questions, but also questions of propaganda, political psychology, and literary fiction, like Kafka's Letter to My Father, or George Orwell's 1984, can sometimes give us the deepest insight into how fascist political desires for a strong father figure actually work. Then, a question about migration. Why can Europeans travel anywhere in the world very easily, but it's not the case for the majority of the world's population? And of course, we want to look at migration law. We want to look at the law that applies or does not apply to people who are outside the system, who are undocumented. But we also want to look at history, and we want to take a broader view of how colonial histories, histories of racism, histories of slavery, have also shaped the way in which our current deportation regime actually works, precisely so that we can also use our imagination to imagine a more just migration politics. Another question is about political rhetoric. There's a lot of people who complain that you can't say anything anymore these days, but often these are the same people who then actually take offense to some of the more controversial political movements of our time, such as Me Too, Black Lives Matter, or expressions of Palestine solidarity. So of course we study free speech law, free demonstration law, but we also study how political rhetoric actually works. And we look at questions of censorship, but we also want to bring in feminist and critical race theory. And sometimes we then also look at literature, because literature can sometimes give us a perspective on censorship and giving and taking offense that these other theories cannot give us so easily. Another question, climate catastrophe, huge question, of course. We look at the Paris Agreement, we look at climate litigation in the courtroom, but this question also touches on democracy, capitalism, and on social movements. But we also want to look at the ideas that underlie our current system that have perhaps enabled a certain view of the relationships between human beings on the one hand and non-human nature on the other hand. And for that, we also turn to literature and poetry sometimes. Then a question that's very urgent right now, the war on terror has been going on, of course, for many years, but now there's a new wave of militarization. And we want to look at the question, how do these political questions get reframed as military or security conflicts? And often when political leaders talk about emergencies and about threats, that is a time to stop thinking and start doing and acting and mobilizing. And in law, politics, and culture, we want to resist this urgent pressure somewhat by actually pausing to think, by reading philosophy on peace, for instance, ethics, and some stuff on militarization to explore whether there are actually alternatives. I'll now take a bit more time to talk about a political phenomenon that benefits greatly from a law, politics, and culture approach. And that is the question that begins with obeying the law. When do we need to obey the law? Why do we need to obey the law? And do we always need to obey the law? Are there cases in which we actually have a right to disobey the law? Or perhaps there's cases in which we even have an obligation to do so. So one of the texts that we use here is Martin Luther King's famous letter from a Birmingham jail. We are in the era of the civil rights movement in the United States, and Martin Luther King at that time needed a permit to hold a protest. Unlike Europeans today, they don't need a permit to protest, but Martin Luther King needed a permit. And he didn't get a permit, so he protested anyway. And then he ended up in jail, where he wrote this famous, beautiful piece of rhetoric. And in that letter, he distinguishes between two types of law, just laws and unjust laws. And he says, just laws need to be obeyed, whereas unjust laws need to be disobeyed. And then he also says about civil disobedience that if you then break an unjust law, you shouldn't just do it in the dark. You should do it openly, lovingly, and with a willingness to accept the penalty. You have to be ready to actually be arrested and then also face the consequences in court, and perhaps you get into jail as he did in this case. Now, we want to really talk about what is the difference between a just law and an unjust law, and who gets to define this. And these are big questions that don't have clear answers. You cannot get these answers from a legal textbook. And one way in which we study these questions is by going back to a very ancient tragedy, Sophocles' Antigone, which is still being performed and adapted in many ways, such as in this novel you see on the slide, a Pakistani novel that sets this ancient Greek play in the context of the war on terror in Pakistan. And this play has two main characters, Antigone and her father Creon, who kind of stand for two very different approaches to law and why you should obey them. And Antigone disobeys her father, who is the ruler of the city's order, that her brother may not be buried because he turned against the city. He raised an army to turn against the city. And Antigone decides to disobey the order of her father that this treasonous person, this traitor, this enemy, not be buried, and that his body needs to lay there to rot. And Antigone wants to bury her brother. And in order to justify why Antigone disobeys Creon's law, the law of the city, she appeals to so-called natural law, and she also appeals to justice. On the other hand, Creon says, but this is the law that I have laid down, and people need to obey the law, or otherwise the whole city will collapse. It will be chaos. We're just out of a civil war, and if people start disobeying the law, everything will collapse. So this is the drama that Sophocles is giving us, and it ends in a big tragedy. And that's the beauty of this text, that actually the question is, of course, well, does Antigone get to decide what justice is? But the play also really shows that Creon's perspective, that he's too strict on Antigone because ultimately she has to die, and the whole city collapses anyway because his view of the law is so stern and so strict. Whereas on the other hand, if you're reading this play, you can also see that Antigone's perspective is quite problematic because she appeals to God, but then of course Creon also appeals to God. So how do you know who has a direct line with God, who knows what justice is, and who gets to decide this? So these perspectives are played out against each other, and we really can use this to really reflect on what justice is, what order is, and how they relate to each other, and then who has a right to be civilly disobedient. What does the law say about civil disobedience? Well, not much, but we can say that the law at least perhaps usually sees a transgression of the law as a crime. And yet, somehow, we don't see the actions of civil disobedience as criminal. When Martin Luther King is transgressing the law in Birmingham, Alabama, and he is protesting despite not having a permit, we don't see Martin Luther King as a criminal. But we also don't really see civil disobedience as revolutionaries, because they still somehow respect the legal order, even if they transgress a particular part of that legal order. They are disobedient in the name of what they believe the justice is that's underlying the legal order as such. They're not seeking to overturn the entire legal order as a whole. Laws cannot really recognize a right to disobey, because that would be very contradictory, right? The law is, of course, demanding that it be obeyed. It cannot legally recognize civil disobedience. And yet there have sometimes been cases in court where people who act against the law, transgress against the law, get a lower sentence in court because they didn't do so for their own self-interest, but they did so for the public good, for what they believed was the public good. And sometimes judges have been more lenient on people for doing that, or sometimes police or prosecution doesn't even prosecute these people to begin with. Also because that is not always politically opportune, because there, of course, sometimes these civil disobedience have the public opinion on their side. We study this question also from the perspective of political philosophy. A very famous philosopher who fled from Nazi Germany because she was Jewish in the 30s and then ended up in the United States, became very enthusiastic about the student movement in the 60s and wrote another famous essay on civil disobedience. And in that essay, Arendt really makes a distinction between individuals who plead conscientious objection, like someone who doesn't want to do military service because they are peace-loving religious people, on the one hand, and people who engage in acts of civil disobedience on the other. And the difference for Arendt is that civil disobedience is something you do together with others. It's not something you do by yourself, but it is a political thing that you do in a group, not to further your own private public opinion, and also not because you're acting in the interest of yourself or that group, but because you believe that a certain policy is unjust and you want to call attention to that together with other people. And I'll give one example of why this is relevant that also touches on the question of culture, memory, and history. Perhaps you recognize the image of Rosa Parks, who at a good moment decides to transgress the law that says that black people have to ride in the back of the bus rather than sit in the front. She sits down in the front of the bus. A police report gets written up, her fingerprints get taken, and she ends up with this famous mugshot. And then when I was looking at this online and looking for some pictures for my PowerPoint, I found this picture, and it's a very motivational kind of fridge magnet kind of slogan, "One person can change the world." Rosa Parks is being commemorated here. Well, one person can change the world. I actually believe that too. But what is kind of being brushed out of the historical picture here is that there were many other people who preceded Rosa Parks' action and who had also engaged in similar acts of civil disobedience. And in fact, Rosa Parks was not just one random individual who one day decided that she was going to sit in front of the bus because she thought it was unfair. She did think that, but she was actually a member of a very influential organization, the National Association for Colored People in the United States. In fact, she worked for this organization that had been campaigning to change these racist laws of segregation for a very long time. So yes, one person can change the world, but one person can do that together with other people. This act of civil disobedience is something that she engaged in collectively with others. It was an act of politics as well. Well, these questions can be complicated even further, but I just hope to have shown how a law, politics, and culture approach is useful for, and perhaps even necessary for, understanding a phenomenon like civil disobedience, which cannot simply be understood from the perspective of law, or as a political theoretical problem, or simply from the perspective of cultural analysis, but it really requires a combination of these disciplinary approaches. To complicate the matter even further, at the end of this video, what do you do with migrants who are protesting, who are not actually citizens, who are transgressing the law in order to change that law, but they're not already citizens who are already subject to that law? They might be doing this at the borders, for instance. One of these strange border phenomena that are actually quite important in our world today really require this kind of interdisciplinary approach. And then another question, of course, of our time, when even states are engaging in violations of law on such a large scale, should we really stick to civil disobedience? Is there not sometimes a duty to resist that should be uncivil? And this is a question of history as well, because are we actually correctly interpreting the civil rights movement as a civil disobedience movement, or were acts of political violence actually much more prominent than we are now led to believe in hindsight, just as people like Nelson Mandela used to be seen as terrorists, and now, of course, they're seen as moral heroes. Well, at University College Tilburg, you will study law, politics, and culture within a broader liberal arts and sciences core. So learn more about our program on our website.